Hello, everybody. Welcome to another exciting special edition of Andrew's Philosophycast. So I'm Andrew Taylor. You can reach us on the Spotify channel, Andrew's Philosophycast, and this is also going to go out on the YouTube channel. If you've got any comments or anything that you want to add, just please get in touch with us on that. This is my very special guest again, George Bull. Say hello, George.
Hello, guys. Hello again. Thank you, Andrew.
Hello. Nice to see you again, George. I hope everything's all right. We thought today we'd bring you a sort of special video podcast on, we know these are uncertain times, so we thought it might be an idea to sort of give you a little bit of sort of philosophical information, philosophical ideas on how you can establish the veracity of all this information that's coming to you and find out what's relevant to you and what's pertinent to you in your life, and help you sort of dismiss some of the information that's out there, and sort of it's just really a sort of tool to try and give you a way to separate the news out there that might not be so accurate from the stuff that might be so accurate for you. So I hope this is a bit of a help for all of you, and if not, it's just a little recap on certain sort of philosophical thoughts on how the world goes. So George is going to get us started with this. Hello, I hope you're all right and everything, George. You wanted to talk about, is it the resistance spy?
Yeah. So I think Andrew gave a good introduction there. There's a lot of people on the internet telling people what to think. And so what I'm saying, this is what you should think, this is the truth, blah, 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 blah. What we're trying to do is to give a little bit of a how to think, how to approach things, sort of without saying this is true, this is false. How do you reach those conclusions? So what's the steps? So you think
it's almost like
sorry, Andrew?
cognitive training, isn't it?
Yes. So think of a builder building a wall. There'll be stages. Me and Andrew won't bloody know, but there'll be stages, sensible things to do to make a good wall. How to get straight. It's the same type of things with assessing a claim. How do you get there? How do you build a reasonable structure that's well made? So the one example that got us to think about doing this podcast is, and it's one from philosophy, your game, Andrew, isn't it? It's about a spy in the French resistance. So obviously in France, occupied by the Nazis, there's a spy. And the spy's working with other people in the underground, so fighting the Nazis. And the analogy goes like this. If for one reason you think the spy is a double agent, so a Nazi pretending to be a resistance fighter, how would you ever disprove your initial belief? Because everything they do could just be trying to con you that they're not who they are. And it's this how. So why would they've killed that Nazi? Well, that's just to get further up the scam, isn't it?
Get more trust. Yeah.
You want to say a bit about it, Andrew, from your perspective?
Well, it's a big idea. So it's all tied up in this sort of where the religious language is sort of meaningful or meaningless, is where you get the philosophical impact with it. So you can talk about all the logical positivists, the Vienna Circle. You can talk about Wittgenstein. Everybody loves to talk about Wittgenstein. He's great. And there's loads of associated stories that you get with it. You can talk about John Wisdom's Parable of the Gardener, which is a good one, which is two sort of blokes in a jungle, and one of them says, "Oh, there's definitely a gardener." The other one's like, "Don't be daft. There's not. It's just the way things are." And he says, "Oh, it's a gardener you can't see." So it's this idea that once you sort of established your position, established your beliefs, that it's sort of human nature kind of to try and find evidence to back that up and sort of set yourself in opposition to other people's beliefs. So what we're trying to do is to try and sort of give you a way of thinking that maybe you need to take yourself out of your beliefs, out of your preconceived ideas, and be open to other ones. So you can talk about I think it's R.M. Hare that talks about the Oxford Dons and the student, where he says there's a student that's convinced that all of his teachers are trying to kill him, which is a meaningful belief, despite the fact there's no meaningful evidence. I think R.M. Hare calls these statements, he calls them blicks. So that's kind of the philosophical thing that you've got with it. But it's a really interesting thing. I think I was listening to some podcast the other day, and it said that Polonius says, "To thine own self be true." And so it's this idea of how do you establish your position vis-a-vis the world after you've got your own like entrenched beliefs. It's something Aristotle talks about. It's a really, really interesting idea. I think later on, after George has talked a little bit about sort of his ideas with this, we'll talk about sort of verification and falsification, kind of how philosophy and science recommend you do these things.
Yeah, and I think one bit to neatly tie up what Andrew was talking there with religion about proving God and all this, in the modern sort of behavioural science, it's referred to as a confirmation bias. So, say you come into a scenario or a bit of learning with one perspective, all the information that you take in, it's self-selecting because you want to self-verify your initial belief. And it requires so much more information to topple that initial starting point. So right or left, well, did I make the right turn? Well, I'll just keep assuming I did because every bit of information I'm going to take in, my brain wants to back up what it initially thought. And it's been proven time and time again in different experiments.
Did you have something to do with, like, what is it, the brain and dopamine and something there were you talking about?
Yeah. So dopamine's a funny cause a funny reaction in your brain. I think it's a hypothalamus. Andrew, you know the brain a bit better than me.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So the dopamine, often misunderstood as a sort of pleasure hormone, but what it actually does is diverts the brain to risk aversion or risk avoidance, and obviously people's major beliefs, belief in God to avoid hell, belief in this to avoid risk, believe in big government information, these type of things. It is about avoiding risk and protecting the body, which is the brain's main job. So studies have proven people are more likely to see connections in things, so ink blots, toss of the coin. So the guy at the casino where it's been red 50 times, he thinks it's going to be blacks coming up, even though every mathematician in the world says it's a fresh roll every time. There's no memory in the roulette wheel. So dopamine forces that type of thinking. So it's actually a biological response that roots you down this confirmation bias.
It's interesting, like, isn't it? You get what you think is sort of free thinking ideas, and you're weighing up evidence in a kind of measured manner is still influenced by everything you've thought before. It's kind of that idea.
Yeah, I like this is one I made. I don't know where I've read this. I made it myself. So pretend you're a caveman. Then one day you have a near miss with a saber-toothed tiger near the reeds at a pond. Your brain will think, well, let's avoid all reeds near a pond because there'll be a saber-toothed tiger there. Your brain doesn't know whether that's the hunting ground of the saber-toothed tiger. That could just be random chance. That could be brilliant fishing ground that you're missing out on now. But your brain doesn't. Over the massive red light is risk of death. So it doesn't really care if you're going to get it wrong as long as it keeps you safe.
Very good. I like that. It's interesting. But yeah, I mean, it kind of links as well, I suppose, to sort of what you find sort of valuable to you in your thinking. So that kind of philosophical ideas and the sort of two schools of thought. It's what you sort of verify and what you falsify, really. So verification, Karl Popper. So that's the only things that are kind of meaningful are things that exist that you can empirically verify, or that are like a tautology, like an unmarried bachelor, or things that you can verify in principle. So that's kind of one way things are meaningful to you there. The other one's falsification. Now I'm a much bigger fan of falsification. This is like DJ Air, isn't it?
Yeah, well, yeah. Is that the Karl Popper as well?
Popper as well, but like Air is the guy who talks about sort of. Or is it anti-flu? Is it anti-flu? Anyway, one of those two guys talks about a falsification. Now, this is, I think, the interesting thing that George was getting on about there with that ground. Sometimes we've got these beliefs and we see value in them without necessarily there being much behind it. So the falsification principle I really like. Falsification principle is that things are only meaningful if the criteria exists by which you can falsify them, which gives you this idea that there can be meaningful statements, so you can get a lot of value, a lot of knowledge, a lot of understanding, if you accept that statements that are falsifiable are equally as valuable as statements which you can verify. So it's almost like this idea of a null hypothesis in science. is just as valuable as, I don't know, discovering something, discovering the truth, discovering that water boils at 100 degrees. It's equally as valuable to discover that water doesn't boil at 99 degrees.
Yeah, yeah. And so if I believe in something that, I don't know, fence paint turns you into a unicorn, and I don't believe in any way that you could possibly prove me wrong, the argument goes that that would be a completely irrational, unfounded belief, so it has no meaning. Is that, have I picked it up right?
Yeah, yeah. And I like that idea. I think in terms of like all this carry on that's going on at the minute, in terms of all this information that's flying around, I do think it's important that you can establish and sort of take it with a pinch of salt what George is saying there, that this idea that being proved wrong doesn't mean that you're an idiot. It does, and that there's got to be a certain flexibility with sort of your belief system. Just don't define yourself by your belief system is kind of, I think, the idea that we get from this.
I think one thing I'd say, and I've a bit of research I'm doing for this, I think it does side with the orthodoxy, doesn't it? The falsification thing, because say there was a study done in a clinical trial, how can us, the general public, falsify a clinical trial? It's impossible. You have to trust that science will come around. Else. But it just doesn't really work that way. It's not accessible to us anymore, is it? I often think of the High Court, where the statistical theory that's been judged too complex for the court to understand, even though it could get people off murder. So DNA, testing, verification, these things, the court just said it's too complicated. It can't handle that level of complexity. So I think when we're talking about things people are coming across on the internet, often it could be the falsification somewhere in the sky anyway. Do you see what I'm trying to get at?
I think we get it. So in terms of, like, just go back to that court analogy there, I read this thing, and I think it's kind of interesting to go with what you said. This idea of DNA evidence seems to be held up in sort of society now as being the absolute apex of everything. Like, oh, it's guaranteed proof, your DNA, yada, 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 it proves it. And this idea has come into sort of the public consciousness through shows like CSI and things like that. A direct result of sort of this proliferation of this idea that DNA is what did you call it in the podcast the other day? Aperon, like the highest thing.
Yeah.
A direct result is a massive, massive shortfall in convictions, because apparently juries now are waiting for this slam dunk of DNA evidence.
Yeah.
And quite regularly in a lot of court cases, there's not all there is, like with what a lot of people are getting at home, is just personal testimony. This is what I believe.
Yeah.
And we've got this sort of principle of testimony of credulity that isn't really backed up.
Yeah. And obviously court is beyond a reasonable doubt in this country.
Yeah.
So where does that sit? It's definitely above 50%, but we're talking 95. And
what's reasonable?
Yeah. And no one in the right mind would say there's never been someone convicted on evidence that was inaccurate or these things. So even with a reasonable doubt, there's still mistrials of justice, these things, people in prison for 20 years, blah, 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 blah. And they have two sides. The other point I was going to make is often on these YouTube videos, the person might say, I've looked up the science. As in science is just one solid block of people saying, yes, this is the way to go. Well, like in the trial, the prosecution and the defense could have two different experts arguing on some very narrow point about DNA evidence with completely different views. So I think science has trotted out, and I think the government have been a bit guilty of this one. We'll back the science. Well, with science in that sense doesn't exist, does it? It's not, we all and only believe in this one outcome of whatever we're talking about. It's varied opinions. That's the whole point of the verification, isn't it?
What's the word for it? Where you've got an overfaith? It's called scientism, isn't it? Which in itself is a self-defeating thing to say that a belief in the rigor of sort of scientific technique is in itself self-contradictory, because the evidence might show up against it or something like that. So it's... it's very interesting. And one point I was going to make later, but I think joins into this. One thing I was going to talk about is the reproduction crisis in science. So I do a trial, how many participants, supposedly the statistics are 70% of trials cannot be replicated. Oh, so yeah.
Try to do the same thing again in all these strict conditions. you can't get the same results or similar results again. So it's a bit of a canon that against a lot of the evidence. So when we're assessing things, I think we've got to be, what would the point, we're labouring here a bit, but it's being cautious on both sides. We're not saying science is always correct. It's using the same critical faculties against that and maybe more outlandish claims.
Think for yourself and be aware of other ideas. The one I wanted to just, and this will be the last bit you'll get from me before I think George gives a nice little sort of thing to tie this up. I wanted to talk, and it's a big experiment that's done in sort of verification and falsification, which is this idea. The statement is that water boils at 100 degrees. Water boils at 100 degrees. Now that you can read, and it's a big experiment that's done in the verification principle. You can go home, you can do this now when you're sick of me and George, you make yourself a cup of tea and you can see this experiment. Now people would say that that is a universal truth. However, if you go and boil some water at Mount Everest, the water will not boil at 100 degrees. The water will boil a lot lower because of air pressure and things like that. So just this idea that just because something is true for one person at one time does not mean it's going to be true for everybody at every time. And I think that's just something to kind of be aware of with this.
No, that's very interesting, Andrew. And one thing I was reading about recently is a lot of clinical trials on conducted on women because of the risk that they're in the menstrual cycle, and that would throw the whole results off. So a large portion of any evidence you see of a drug is mainly tested on men because of that reason. So the example is Viagra could have some benefits for women and pain relief in women, but it's never been tested. But it was it was tested on men for heart attacks, and it obviously had the
side effect
everyone knows about. So one more point from me, and I think this is a really neat one, this for the internet age. One guy I follow, and he's a bit of an interesting guy. The only statistician I know that's been on Wipeout, the program with the spinning things and the falling off stuff. So it's Dr. Spiegelhalter, the Queen's Professor of Risk. He talks about the Groucho Marx principle. The very fact that you're seeing a statistic should lead you to be skeptical, because that statistic would have been through so many rounds of being produced that it'll just be exaggerated and it'll not be as originally conceived. And there's a massive skew to report outlandish, extreme results, evidence, and these things. So that when you first see something, you think, oh, this is out of the ordinary. I should initially be a little bit reserved about my judgment, because it stood against all the other statistics that it's competed against.
Why is it called the Groucho Marx thing?
Well, you know this. Why don't you tell them punchline?
Is this I wouldn't be a member of any... Well, I wouldn't join any club that would have us as a member.
Yeah, exactly. so if they want you in, you should be skeptical, because they want you in. It sort of works. It's
I like that. That's excellent, that, George. That's really, really good. Really good. Just go on.
No, you go, Andrew.
I was just going to say, what's that quote again that you were going to say? Is it Moore's Law or something?
Explain. Oh, yes. So the other one, the other little pity line, I think it's Hanlon's razor. So not Occam's razor, Hanlon's razor. The paraphrase: never attribute to malice what could be attributed to stupidity instead. So again, I think this goes back to the brain, amygdala, don't mean these things. The brain is meant to be a risk assessor. How can it keep my integrity? How can it keep me alive? So that's risk to the body. So that's the high value item. I've lost my train, Andrew. Can you think from finishes off?
I think it's just this idea that it's very, very easy in these sort of times to sort of define yourself in kind of opposition to other people's views, and just say that, that's wicked, they're spreading this is misinformation, they're bad people, or to say that I'm a good person, this is what I believe. It's not a matter of sort of evil and goodness with people's views. Don't think that there's goodies and baddies. There's not goodies and baddies. They're just people who think in a certain different way, and that can be down to ignorance, that can be down to stupidity. Try and think I thought this was a brilliant point when George told us about it the other day. It's kind of just like football fans. As like a football fan, you think your team are the goodies, the other team are the baddies.
Yeah.
It's just a different way of looking at it. There's no real baddies.
Yeah. Your personal experience trumps everything else. and everything's done to spite you or whatever. It's psychology. It's like, oh, that was a short text I got of Andrew the other day. He must hate us now, rather than
right. I do hate you. That's right.
yeah. But you know what I mean? Rather than a million other things, maybe I had a row with somebody else, maybe you couldn't be bothered, maybe you were tired, maybe the phone switched off, maybe. But I'm certain that you're pissed off with me. It's like another bias in your brain.
Yep. Very, very good. Very, very good.
I think the one thing I'd like to finish off on is that, and I've been guilty of this on the internet before. I'm not as bad as other people, but when you're debating people's different points, if you want a positive outcome, just railing against them, hammering them, saying it's stupid, saying it's ridiculous, moronic, that entrenches the belief further. Hopefully what we've talked about shows how this is risk preservation. This is the number one thing the body wants to do. This is all sort of tied into that. Where more positive ways are sort of sharing information, not like hammering it down. Well, what can we do about it? Often these thoughts are quite passive, so it's just a trail of things that, but I'm just going to passively follow it rather than do anything about it. So one example, I know people aren't with global warming, but there's definitely a lot of plastic on the beach. So don't get massively upset about global warming. Maybe just go and pick up some plastic on your nearest beach or your nearest field. Do you see the difference in the two things, Andrew?
Yeah. I think it's really, really clever. I think it's really well put as well. In terms of you're never going to convince someone of an opinion that perhaps you put forward and proliferate by saying that they're stupid, they're dumb. For one, they're probably not going to be stupid or dumb, and two, that's the thing they're going to get stuck with. And I think George really explains this kind of psychological and cognitive effect of if you're telling someone that they're stupid, they're immediately going to go on the defensive with that and define themselves in opposition against you. And I think it's really, really interesting and really like pertinent at this time.
Yeah,
to be aware of that.
The joke is you're stupid, but listen to the point that I think's clever. It's like talking to the bloody wall, isn't it? If that's what you think it is, if that's what you set the person up to be, you're both wasting your time.
Very true. Very true. But anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's good.
Well, again, I hope you really, really enjoyed this, folks. We're going to try and put this on the YouTube channel, try and get this out there so you can see our pretty faces in the lockdown. If you've got any questions, just put them in the comment section. Do listen out to George and I's podcast as well. And I hope you are all right. Take it easy.
Right. So I'm going to try and stop recording.